Today on The State of Us, will Democrats throw it all away in the 2024 election? And a political homeless shelter. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the friendly redneck liberal and the senior resident historian here at True Chat, Mr. Lance L. Jackson. So, we've got a couple interesting things to look at today. Parties on both sides, how voters are feeling. If they don't broaden their appeal, referring to the Democratic Party, they'll end up relying on Republicans to save democracy. And we'll look at the political homeless shelter. The GOP left me, that's Adam Kissinger, in the cold. The same thing has happened to millions of Americans of both parties. So we get a little dive into what's going on in the politics of both parties, how it may affect 2022, but even broader than that, how it extends out to 2024. However, before we dive in, Lance, to Democrats' delusions and political homelessness, what is the word of the day?
Well, it's a common word, but it's one that I've been using more and more lately, and I think it fits, and that is accountability. Accountability has 6 syllables, so I'm already the odds-on favorite to win today. But it's spelled ACCOUNTABILITY. Accountability. It's a noun, and what it means is obliged to be responsible for one's actions. And I think it's something that is missing today throughout society. You read these articles and it's finger pointing and this and that and the other, and nobody's being accountable. Nobody's taking accountability for their own doings. And then in Representative Kinzinger's article, he speaks to that openly and says, this is something that is lacking in today's political world. And so I see it working with young people. The representative talks about it in politics, and it's, I'm this way because of everybody else. And nobody's taking accountability for their own situation. And I think that's one of the major things that we're missing in our society today. So accountability, the word of the day.
The word of the day. So let's take a look at the Democrats' delusions. For those that may not recall, or I think it's just worth calling it out, a delusion is a belief or impression that is firmly maintained despite being contradicted by what is generally accepted as reality or rational argument. So let's bear that in mind as we talk about.
You trying to take over my job?
A few of these items. No, I think that in this case the definition of the word is important because generally is accepted as reality. Well, I don't accept this as reality, but the second part of that, or rational argument. So let's think of rational argument as we're talking about this. Both articles today are Wall Street Journal pieces. They are linked, of course, at thestateofus.org, so you can certainly go check out the articles there if you'd like to read them for yourself. But let's take a look. There's 3 main components brought up in this article entitled, Will Democrats Throw It All Away in the 2024 Presidential Election? So it basically leads in and says, yet beguiled by 3 comforting myths, and they are as follows: that people of color think and vote alike, that economics trumps culture, and that a progressive majority is emerging, Democrats have failed to respond to the threat posed by the new Republican coalition. So let's talk about each of those errors as the article contends. First up, Lance, this is a big one. I feel like that you and I have been mentioning to folks sort of anecdotally, but nevertheless is relevant, which is, number 1, unity among people of color. Early in the century, many Democrats came to believe that long-term demographic trends would produce a Democratic majority. The expectation was that decades of robust immigration from Latin America and the Asia-Pacific region would steadily increase the diversity of the U.S. population. As these Americans entered the electorate, they would join forces with other people of color, especially African Americans and Native Americans, to strengthen support for the Democratic Party. The article goes on, Lance, to tell us how this belief almost seemed to prove true with Barack Obama's election. But then, as we found out, Joe Biden comes along, he received only 53% of the Hispanic vote, compared with Hillary Clinton's 62%. And Biden fell short of her share, referring to Clinton's, among Hispanics in 7 of 9 swing states. Unless Democrats can improve their performance among Hispanics, Florida will remain out of reach. Turning Texas blue will be an impossible dream, and the party's entire electoral college strategy will be in jeopardy. So this goes back to a theme that I think we've talked about before, which is taking any group of your voters, but in this case, people of color, for granted, assuming that, they're going to rally around a single principle.
Well, the voters are going to hold the candidates accountable, right? They're going to say, what are you doing for us? And I think when you led with the fact that they were taken for granted, that's what starts to happen. You just think, well, they're going to vote for us. So we're not really listening to them. We're not going to listen to their concerns. And as you know, it's wrong to group an entire nationality of people because everyone has their own concerns. Everyone has the different things that they're interested in. And so you can't just speak esoterically out there of this and think, oh, I'm going to touch, and especially I have a problem with Hispanic voters, because Hispanic voters come from, multiple countries and nationalities, and we group them politically into one group. And as they talk about, the Cubans in Florida have different ideas and different things that they're interested in and concerned about than the people coming up from Central America that live in Texas and Arizona and New Mexico. And both parties just talk about Hispanic votes. So I think you need to be careful there because these people are going to hold you accountable for it. I will disagree, though, with the editorialized statement that unless Democrats can improve their performance, Florida will remain out of reach, blue will be an impossible dream, and the party's entire electoral college strategy will be in jeopardy. Yeah, well, Republicans have the same problem because these are growing populations of voters, and both sides need these voters. And so both sides are going to have to be accountable to this demographic. So yes, is it happening? Yes, we've talked about it. Are these voters starting to split more evenly? Yes, they are. But we're seeing splits among other voting groups as well. So I think that's a little far-fetched to just make that blatant statement that, Florida and Texas are going to remain the same and they're going to have to I think everybody's going to have to change their electoral strategy. I think everybody's going to have to change the way they approach, as the article says, people of color. I'm not even comfortable saying that. I don't like that. I think you have to approach all voters differently. And I think for too long, both political parties have just assumed, maybe rightfully so, that certain political blocs will vote for them no matter what.
Well, arguably, one of the challenges that Republicans faced with the election of Barack Obama was an inability to widen their appeal to a larger audience. And love Trump or hate Trump, the reality is he widened the party's, inclusion. I mean, he spoke to a lot of people and brought a lot of new voters to the party, or a lot of people who had not been voting into the fold. And that is an example of, what can happen when your party reconsiders its approach. Now, again, you may not like the way that it took place, but the point there is that they were saying similar things about Republicans during Barack Obama's election of, well, you're relying too much on the people you've always relied on, and
you need to open up. We need to open up the party. We need to reach different groups of people if we want to remain a viable party. And to your point, that's obviously being done because we're seeing that historically minority groups are starting to split their votes more and more among Republicans and Democrats.
One of those nuanced areas that I think is important, and the article mentions this, is that, you can now see some gaps between Hispanics and African Americans on certain issues. For example, Hispanics are actually a lot more likely than African Americans to view police misconduct as isolated incidents rather than evidence of systemic bias. And only 35% of Hispanics have a favorable view of critical race theory compared with 60% of African Americans. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is this greater point that the author is making of assuming that, all people who are not white are going to group together and vote together and are going to, support the same initiatives and people is just not true.
Right. They don't.
They have very different views, for example, of those key issues. And Democrats have firmly taken a stand, or at least it would appear, on police misconduct and critical race theory. And they're sacrificing, a decent share of Hispanics possibly at that expense. They're not staying very accountable to what Hispanic voters are saying they care about. They're not really even acknowledging it. It's just like, well, this is what we think and this is just right. And I think that's, a larger issue across parties. It's not just the Democrats. But in this case, obviously, it's an area where they can't take one of their constituent groups for granted because Hispanics are proving that, a majority of them may not even support the Democratic Party in the next presidential election. It's close enough that realistically that may change. The next item to look at, Lance, we'll get into in the next segment, is economic determinism. This from the beginning was the notion, right, that economics trumps culture. Does economics really trump culture? Well, of course, like many things, there's a nuanced answer to it, but what beliefs might Democrats be holding on to that are keeping them from seeing the truth? What delusion might they be living in? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Much has changed since Franklin D. Roosevelt took office, but for some Democrats, it will always be 1933. And kind of, when I read that, Lance, it sort of reminded me of, for some Republicans, it'll always be Ronald Reagan. Just too many believe that economic issues are the, quote, real issues, and cultural ones are mostly diversions invented by their adversaries for political purposes. But for Americans across the political spectrum, the article contends, social, cultural, and religious issues are real and fundamentally more important than economic ones. These issues shape their identity and reflect their deepest convictions.
I couldn't disagree more with the author on this one. Just absolutely don't agree with this at all.
Is that a Democratic delusion right there?
Well, people will have to take it for what it is. But I think if we search our own souls, I have never known anyone that when it comes time to push the voting button, that they didn't think about their pocketbook. Contrary to any, you can have a strong feeling about this, that, and the other. But if you're doing better economically than you were before the person was elected, you tend to vote for them. And if you're doing worse since that person was elected, then you want them out and you want someone else in. And I think that's the bottom line. And I think we hear a lot about the cultural issues. We talk about the Supreme Court. We hear about abortion. We hear about the right to choose schools. And we play that up, okay? And I understand the play that the media is giving it and that politicians are giving it. But I think the accountability piece is, am I better off financially now than I was 4 years ago? Or 2 years ago, or 6 years ago, or what's this person promising me financially in my life? That is the ultimate determiner of who you vote for. Now, Are the other things maybe gaining in importance? Are they maybe, having more of a people deciding that? I think so. But to just make the flat statement, these issues shape their identity and reflect their deepest convictions. I don't buy that. People are worried about how they're living and how they're going to live in the future and how their kids are going to live in the future. And I don't think it's cultural issues. I think a lot of people think it is. I think people maybe are saying it is to the pollsters, which is why they can, the author can make this statement because here's what the polls say. But I think even when you talk about President Trump, he did some things, whether, you agreed with them or not, that put more money in people's pockets. Now, did it help the people that he said it was going to help? We can debate that if you want. I don't think so. Okay. But he gave the illusion that the economy was better. So therefore he gained support. And he talked to people about how he was going to make the economy better. And so people gave him support. I don't think they really cared about the social issues as much as this author pertains, but that's just my opinion.
It's a difficult thing to measure for sure, because the other item here is that we're counting on people's conscious ability to articulate why they support somebody. And generally speaking, I agree with Lance's contention that I think if you ask people what they're voting for, I think they would tell you that, well, yeah, the economics, that's what matters most to me. Most voters would probably tell you that. Whether or not that's actually true, I think is more complicated simply in that some people may think that's what they're voting for. But for example, with President Trump, did it have more to do about speaking to the people that have wronged you, the people that are to blame for the situation that we're in, the struggle of the, non-college educated white person? I mean, did those things, while yes, sort of tied to economics, but more the blame and the social game that was being played, resonate greater with people than the case of specifically what I intend to do economically? I would like to think that voters vote based on, what is good for the country economically, what is good for me economically. But then there's also the other issue that you bring into that of, do they really understand what's good for them economically? Because you sort of hinted at this, Lance. One could contend, as we have spoken about, I think at length, that generally if you just looked at the policies and who different policies favor, a lot of the policies that Democrats were advocating for in 2016 would have actually favored a larger share of many of Trump's supporters than a lot of the policies that Trump actually proposed. In other words, a lot of the policies that he proposed and put in place had an outsized benefit to wealthy, educated Americans. Yet the largest, constituency that he had were non-college educated, middle class or lower, white workers. I think what Trump did is he tapped into, let's combine these, right? Let's link your struggles economically with these social issues that you allegedly care so much about. And I'm not sure that Democrats have come up with an effective counter to that. I don't think they have. I think it's, well, there's this economic thing, that we can do for you and it'll be great. But we're not ever going to address or speak to these fears or concerns you have. And that part, I guess I would agree with the author on, is that, figuring out how people fit in, who their, tribe is and who's on their team, whether or not we should be that way. Humans are hardwired to try to draw those lines and try to figure out, who's friend and who's foe. And maybe it's noble that Democrats, from an economic standpoint, aren't playing into that. But nobility doesn't necessarily win elections.
Well, you just summed up everything that I believe in. And what you're saying is that what I believe in is not what the majority of the country believes in. That
I'm saying I think a majority of the country wants to believe what you believe. I'm not sure if in reality they actually believe that. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I think they would listen to what you said, and I think they'd be like, yeah, that's 100%. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
But then I think if you look at what they do, it's like, well, maybe they don't know that they're not doing what they believe, but they don't seem to be doing it. So
No, I think you're right. I mean, there's the final line of this part of the article says, Democrats shouldn't ignore the core of their coalition, but to win, they need to walk a fine line between mobilizing the base and attracting voters outside it. That I think in a nutshell sums it up, But it's like we've talked about that for years, right? That we know that no matter who the Democrats run, they're probably going to get 40% of the vote. And we know that whoever the Republicans run, they're going to get 40% of the vote. I mean, it doesn't matter, if they ran them from, the planet Triton and, the purple person versus the person from planet Strixon and the green person. They were Republicans and Democrats. They'd both get 40% of the vote. And there'd be that 20% in the middle who decide, well, who do I want to vote for? And you got to win 10.1% of that 20% in the middle. And that's what we're talking about here, right? I mean, there are those people that no matter, on the other side, no matter who you would run that was an awesome candidate for president, wouldn't vote for him because they didn't have the right initial after their name. And that tribalism and enemy and foe is the thing we have to get rid of. What happened to, I'm going to vote for the person who's going to do the best for the country, because if the country's doing well, then inherently I will do well. That's what I'm missing. That's what I don't see happening on either side. But I think it's a key point. If the Democrats don't figure out how to attract voters who are outside of their base, they're in trouble, just like the Republicans will be as well.
This next point kind of plays into that as well and leads us into the concept of the political homeless shelter, which Mr. Kissinger has contended. And that's the emerging progressive majority. This is the other Democratic delusion. While it is true that over the last few decades, there's been an increase in the number of voters who describe themselves as liberal, moderates and conservatives continue their predominance. Listen to this. This stat is pretty interesting here. The most recent survey of voters' ideology found that only 7% of the electorate consider themselves very liberal. Another survey described 5 hypothetical political parties and found that only 9% of voters associated themselves with a far-left party whose positions matched those of Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, compared with 26% who supported a center-left party corresponding to Mr. Biden. The survey, by the way, did not mention any of the politicians by name.
I wonder if this author looked at the same article that we did.
That's what I was kind of wondering.
Remember when we did that, and we looked at it because it had 5 parties,
right.
And it showed
what I was thinking.
That most people are not arch conservatives and most people are not extreme liberals. The politicians talk to us and want to put us in one camp or the other, but the majority of us are somewhere in the middle, that the outliers are 10%.
Yes.
That you have 10% who are just so strong conservative. They believe, this, and this. And then you have about, like the article says here, 7 to 9%, I would say 10%, that are extremely liberal. So those are the extremes. The rest of us, 80% of us, are somewhere between that. We're moderates who lean one way or the other on social and economic issues, but we lean that way. It's not like we're hardcore. We can be swayed to move, to get behind something if the argument is valid enough and it hits some of the major points that we think are important.
I think this line, Lance, sums up some thinking well. Most Americans want evolutionary, not revolutionary change. In other words, they don't want the table to be flipped over. That makes them nervous, right? They've come to know a system, to understand it. They want change, but they want it to build on what they know, not to wipe it out and start over. And particularly the fact that there's enough Americans that are still alive, and this goes back to your Latin America component too, of potentially losing some of those voters from a Democrat standpoint who believe, right or wrong, that socialism has been, generally speaking, a disaster for most of the world. So when you have people like the Bernie Sanders of the world who supposedly, are going to caucus with the Democratic Party talking about stuff like this, you do risk alienating the people who look at that and say, no way, I don't want nothing to do with that. In fact, I will actively vote to stop it. And this goes to, I think, a theme that Lance and I have talked about as well, which is that, at least in my opinion, the Democrats should cut out their far left constituency and throw them to the wind and say, you guys have every right to advocate for what you want, but you are not going to drag down this party by continuing to insist that Americans feel this way when most Americans, again, as is evidenced by the data, do not feel this way. You have the right to exist, to advocate for those things, to push for those things, absolutely. But you should not have the right to drag down the rest of the Democratic Party, which generally is a good bit more moderate. And I would, by the way, extend that to the Republican Party as well. I don't think it's just the Democrats. I think for the health of both parties, they ought to cut out the extreme, because the extremes are the ones that seem to have the loudest voice right now. And the danger in that is the longer they speak and the louder they are, the less moderate people will become. We've also done the psychology of voting. And we've talked a lot about how people will gravitate towards strength. So if they perceive those areas as strong, it may actually skew what they truly feel to become more extreme. It's the same thing as mob mentality, right?
Well, and the idea of the far left and the far right espousing their views, which they have the right to do, but it drives that wedge between the rest of us so that we won't even talk to the other side. And that's where we're falling short. Is that, Democrats won't even talk to Republicans and Republicans won't even talk to Democrats because the arch conservatives and the arch liberals have painted the other side, as you said earlier, as the enemy, as the arch enemy, and they're horrible. And so we have nothing in common with them and we can't even talk to them. And if we're not talking, we're not solving problems. And so on both sides of the aisle, the extremes are driving the message right now. And that's not good for either party, and it's not good for the country as a whole.
So let's talk about how this notion goes into what Adam Kissinger calls the political homeless shelter. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Starting in the year 2000, Lance, whites with four-year college degrees moved toward Democrats, as whites without four-year college degrees maintained their long-term movement away. Mr. Biden's candidacy continued the shift of educated voters toward the Democratic Party while reversing only modestly the shift of voters without four-year degrees in the opposite direction. The irony there is that historically, right, Lance, growing up, the Democrats were the party of the working class. Mm-hmm. Fight that elitism, baby. The unions, the strength of the working people. And now you got a bunch of soft snobs in the liberal wing of the party who apparently don't seem to be well equipped to speak to the white working class voter. That seems to be a real issue just from a data standpoint that Democrats are facing. They try to give it some lip service, but it pains me, Lance, sometimes when you watch Democrats talk on television, how uninformed they are about how the white working class lives.
Well, to the point of the author of the first article, that's where the Democrats have just assumed that these people will continue to vote for them. So we're not going to talk to these people. They're struggling economically. They need support. They need help. So they know we're the people of that. So we're going to take them and we're going to go even further away from them because we're not going to really speak to their needs because we know they're with us. And to the point of the first article, that's where the Democrats are falling short, is because they're taking a leap of faith that these people will follow us anywhere. And the numbers show they're not. since, this says, 2000, I would go back to 1980 and Ronald Reagan, when this started to happen. And it just goes to show you can't take any demographic group for political ideas for granted, that you have to continue to speak to them with what's important to them and how you're going to help them try to achieve the American dream, whatever they see it that being.
Congressman Adam Kissinger says, America is at a crossroads. Politically speaking, so am I. The Republican Party I joined decades ago is unrecognizable today. It has favored conspiracy theories over truth, anger over hope, and division over problem solving. As I serve my final months in Congress, I find I am left carrying the torch for the values and principles of a party that's been overtaken by partisan politicos looking for the limelight and clinging to their sense of power instead of upholding their oaths of office. I am holding out hope for what I know the Republican Party has been and can be. But every day that passes, I'm feeling more politically homeless, and I'm not alone.
Amen, brother. Preach it. He goes on and everything after every paragraph. I'm like, yep. And there, and it's like, he's got it. He said, bad actors are getting rich by peddling disinformation and fear, and the American people are paying the price. From wild conspiracy theories to carefully crafted misinformation, the public is more susceptible than ever to falling for these untruths. Saying it's a disservice to the people who trust them would be a severe understatement. It's a dereliction of duty. Come on. It's just like what, I can't, I'm not going to argue, and I don't, here's somebody who is, a Republican who is saying, I'm basically getting run out of office because I believe in the American dream. I believe in the truth. I believe in the honesty of elections. And because of that, my party doesn't want me. So what have they done? Well, they just quit, right? No, they started an organization called Country First for reasonable people of goodwill who want to bring truth, and here's the word, accountability back to government. In 1 year, it has grown to nearly 150,000 members, including 6,000 volunteers, with chapters in all 50 states. Country First. What a novel concept to bring truth and accountability to the government in an organization called Country First. Wow. Put aside our differences and do what's best for America. That seems like it's something that I've studied before. That made this country great. That we set aside our differences and decided we do what's best for the country. While not always agreeing what that is, we would hold that truth to be self-evident, right?
It's interesting, Lance, this notion that political parties would look out for themselves over the interest of the companies dates back, in fact, almost to the very founding of our country. Never will I be one to pass up an opportunity to quote our second president, John Adams, but he said that at the time, there is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader, and concerting measures in opposition to each other. This, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution. So we've been worried about this for a little while.
We've faced differences and troubles before, right? And what brought us back together? The idea that we're going to do what's right for the country. And Representative Kissinger has said through his organization, he has started a nationwide effort called Primary First, focused on voter education and engagement. Listen to this. What a novel concept. I want to encourage Americans to show up for primary elections and vote for candidates who will be servant leaders to their constituents. It shouldn't be a novel idea to tell the truth, to stand up for our democracy and to serve with integrity. But it is. Now more than ever, we need to turn things around and put in the work to break free from toxic tribalism and extreme partisanship. Your words. Tribalism. We're gonna who the enemy is, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. We need people who are going to serve with integrity. And how are we going to get them? We're going to have to show up and vote for the candidates that will do this.
What a concept. We have to keep our elected officials accountable to what we want them to do. So we can't rely on Washington to be accountable. We have to keep them accountable.
Exactly.
Is that what I'm hearing?
If we want to if we want the problem fixed, we have to fix it by whom we vote for. We can't elect people and say, you go fix this problem. We have the government officials and the government and the Congress that we have because that's who we voted for. If we don't like it, it's up to us to change it. It's up to us to quit listening to the conspiracy theories and the lies and innuendos and the people that are out there telling us things on the news so that we will support one group or the other. It's up to us. We, the people.
So, Lance, why do we have this conversation today?
Because it's the right thing to do.
Well, yes, I like that. Summed it up well. That's all we need to know, folks.
I mean, what more is there?
What more is there? Do the right thing.
Well, because we have bosses here, and the bosses at True Chat have a mission, and the mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've done that today. We've given you the honesty of what's going on out there. We're not trying to sell you any goods. We're not trying to get you to vote for one candidate or the other. We're just saying it's our government. We get what we vote for. We need to make a difference. We need to hold these people accountable. If they're not going to speak to us, then we need to put people in there that will be honest and work for America, not work for themselves, not work for what's best for them. And if we get a little bit on the edges, that's good enough. We have to have people who are working for us. And if you like today's show and you're talking about it and people say, well, where are you hearing this kind of honesty and good reporting? Well, tell them it's on The State of Us, and it's a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere podcasts are found.
You'll hear us Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the mornings. And of course, we're also found across the nation on AM and FM radio stations on the weekends. For The State of Us, who wins today, Lance?
I did.
Oh, you think so?
Yep.
Okay, I thought I brought quite the comeback there.
You did. You brought a good charge, but I think we shut you down.
Oh, you think so?
I think I built up an insurmountable lead.
An insurmountable lead. Yeah. Okay.
When Bradley gets done editing,
he'll keep us accountable.
He'll hold us accountable, and he'll see who had it the most.
For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.